officer, and we know that tragedies befall not just civilians in a sense, but also those people that we ask to do their jobs on bikes. I mean, we're talking about a number of professions who cycle as part of their profession, including Constable Smith here. Are we going to protect them, and are we going to have a safe workplace for them in a sense, or not? Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, as I'm sure Yvonne could as well, and Hugh, but I think a big part of this legislation is common sense. As Cheri mentioned, a good number of drivers are doing this and motorists are doing this already. But experience has told us through any legislative amendments and change, I'll use seat belts as an example, or the street racing legislation that was passed a couple of years ago, which has resulted in a 40% reduction in speed-related fatalities. I think passing legislation and putting forward legislation does a couple of things. Number one, it begins the conversation around sharing the road and the importance of the rules of engagement and clarity that we've all talked about. Secondly, it really reminds motorists of their rights and responsibilities, and the legislation, while regulatory, as Cheri mentioned, does provide for fines coincident with other amendments to the Highway Traffic Act that measure in the thousands. But also, if it passes as we'd like, it includes a powerful component for education. So much like alcohol education and remediation programs, if you get charged and convicted of driving while impaired, you're required to go on an education program to remind you of what driving while impaired can do and the implications of that and of your behavior. So in the same vein, we've adopted a suggestion that motorists who are convicted of this would have to go back to school and become reacquainted with the responsibilities of sharing the road and driving safely. And I think that, and again, that was a measure that we adopted that's been undertaken in a number of U.S. states with great effect. So I think that opportunity to remind people and to, as a deterrent, really hit them in terms of the cost and the inconvenience of taking time off work, of having to sit in a classroom. These things prove effective, as I'm sure Hugh can attest. And I know my husband talked often about these kinds of deterrent effects in terms of re-educating motorists about their rights and responsibilities, because they do get complacent. People make errors in judgment, but far too often there are motorists who are risk takers, and we need to address those kinds of behaviors. Does that help?
Mm-hmm. Eleanor, can I get you just to describe, or how would you characterize the state of cyclist-driver relations overall?
Well, I certainly don't own that issue on this panel, but I think that there are times when we're happier than others, and there are days when we find ourselves rather frustrated. I want to talk again about the majority of drivers who are courteous and very kind and give us more than enough space to maneuver. There are a pernicious few who, again, make errors in judgment, but also take risks. And that kind of risk-taking behavior is a pernicious, sort of pervasive set of behaviors that exists throughout our society. And unfortunately, can impact the relationships between cyclists and motorists. Cyclists are full stop afraid. We did a poll last year, an omnibus poll of 1,100 Ontarians, and the number one reason people don't ride their bikes is because they're too afraid to do so. That is an absolute, travesty, really, when we think about the number of people that could be adding to our environment, that could be contributing to lowering our healthcare costs, that want a bike but don't because they're simply too afraid to leave their house on their bike. And that's absolutely unacceptable. So if we want to address that, we need to sort of lower that fear barrier, have legislation like this in place, and start improving the communication that he referred to. So as to how the relationships are between motorists and cyclists, most of the time they're just fine. Occasionally, when cyclists are frightened or they feel that they're threatened or someone is aggressive with them, I think it's only human that we respond in kind occasionally because we feel frightened and fear for our safety. I don't know many other pastimes, where you leave your home with your ID in your pocket, understanding that you might not come home and your loved ones might be seeing you at the hospital. At the risk of sounding dramatic, that is something that occurs to cyclists, how vulnerable we are on a daily basis. And it's unfortunate incidents like that on the weekend that remind us of our vulnerabilities. So I think we need motorists to understand and to go back to because most of them cycled as children, even though less of them do now, to remind themselves of what it was like when they were on a bike and just to remember what exactly it is that we need when we're on the road.
J'aimerais poser une question à Eleanor ou à Yvonne en français, si possible. Comment est-ce qu'un projet de loi comme celui-là, quand on regarde ce qui s'est passé au Québec en fin de semaine, comment est-ce qu'un projet de loi comme celui-là permettrait d'éviter ce genre de tragédie-là au Québec?
Finalement, on parle d'éducation, c'est le fait qu'on parle de ce problème. On ne sait pas la situation cette fin de semaine passée. Il me semble que si c'était une erreur de la part du conducteur de l'automobile. Si on regarde direct en avant lorsqu'on conduit, on va pas, tu sais, on ne frappe pas le monde en avant de nous. Alors, tu sais, s'il y avait une règle de même dans cet instant, je ne sais pas si ça serait quelque chose d'effectif, mais finalement, si on a les règles de même et on parle on a cette conversation, on change, tu sais, les manuels d'éducation pour les conducteurs. Si on a ça dans la tête, on est plus vigilant lorsqu'on est dans notre automobile. Alors, il y a un bon effet graduel lorsqu'on on applique cette nouvelle loi, si finalement on l'a ici en Ontario et finalement à Québec, en Colombie-Britannique aussi et à travers le Canada. On verra.
Ce que j'ajouterais au Québec, la question de la tragédie cette fin de semaine, c'est que même avec la loi en place, il va y avoir des collisions, des accidents, des erreurs de jugement de la part des conducteurs. Et voilà, on n'a pas tous les faits de ce qui est arrivé au Québec, alors je dirais que ce serait un petit peu, tu sais, il faut éviter de préjuger les conséquences et les résultats. Mais alors, je dirais, ça nous revient comme message de voilà, nous autres, on est vraiment... c'est une question de risque et les cyclistes sortent de la maison chaque jour et se sentent très vulnérables. Alors, c'est une question de vulnérabilité, c'est un mot difficile à dire en fin de compte, mais c'est ça le message et en plus, une question de respecter. Et voilà, on va voir qu'est-ce qui s'est passé au Québec, on ne sait pas tous, mais c'est une tragédie énorme, c'est certain.
Some news that obviously you've probably seen within the past 24 hours, it's related to this in some ways, is all of these unpaid traffic tickets. So these are folks who have been pulled over by the police for violating the rules that exist already. So speeding, running red lights, stop signs, that kind of stuff. I'd be particularly interested in hearing from Constable Smith, how do you feel new rules would actually have an impact if so many people are basically just getting away scot-free with breaking the rules that exist?
Well, you're